Today we're looking at minerality, how the composition of the soil in a vineyard, most importantly its mineral content, can or may impact the expression of the grape and experience of the wine by the time we've poured ourselves a glass. This is a source of ongoing discussion, oftentimes controversy among scientists, winemakers, connoisseurs, and even those of us who simply love wine. Do we taste minerality? Are we able to smell it? Can we even see it in the glass? To get to the bottom of it, we've certainly got the right people in the room today. So viewers, join me in welcoming today's panel. To get to the bottom of it, we've certainly got the right people in the room today. Viewers, join me in welcoming today's panel. From Cornell Agritech up in Geneva, New York, we have Anna Catherine Mansfield, Associate Professor of Enology at Cornell University. We have Anne-Marie Morse, who is a wine educator, journalist, and a certified wine judge. And from Grand Cru Selections, we have Sommelier Thomas Pastuszak, VP of Sales and Hospitality. A couple notes to our viewers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We got a couple quick program notes, and then we'll cut right to it. This event is being recorded. Yes, we are live right now, and it'll be viewable at this very same URL afterwards. So give us about 5 minutes if you've missed today's event. And you can join us and review the recording at the same URL. Share it freely with anyone you think may be interested. We are interested in your input, your questions, so please submit those in the chat, which you may open up at the top right of your video player. There's a little dialog box there. Click that, open up the chat, submit your questions, and I'll get them. Throughout the discussion, we'll also be sharing a lot of URLs and resources, which will be very useful, I presume, to all of you. So heads up for those. And if you're watching the archived recording, those links, the chat will be unavailable. So those links are actually available below in the overview section, just below if you are watching the recording. We also have a glossary for you. We'll be sharing words and definitions as we go. We're going to be getting into the weeds here, and some terms may be unfamiliar to some of you. Okay, so let's get started. As always, I'm curious what kind of viewers have joined our audience today, so I'm hoping you will all grab your smartphones, scan the QR code that's going to appear on the screen so we can get interactive here. Question number one, I want to ask you, which describes you? Let's get a sense of who's in our audience today. The poll question is up, and there are several choices, right? So we've got viticulturist, vineyard manager, etc., those who work on in that field, enologists, winemakers. Are you a hospitality professional, food and bev? Are you a wine seller, a distributor, wine specialist, journalist, media, or otherwise, or simply a wine lover? Those who are just kind of generally curious about this. So results are going to come in a little bit slow here, but we'll share those in just a minute. We've got mostly winemakers, looks like some wine lovers. I knew it was going to be a pretty healthful mix here, panelists, so we'll see. What this means is pretty good diversity of opinion, because I know there's some strong ones, certainly among this panel. So it looks like wine lovers are eking it out. We're at like 65% wine lovers. Second place, enologists. We've got some viticulturists. Good, solid balance among this audience. I'm very pleased to see that. You're never really sure who's going to join us in the room here. Yeah, so it's kind of all over the place. You'll see the results there. So let's move on. So yeah, again, mostly wine lovers, but people all across the profession. Here is question number two. What word or words would you use when describing minerality in a wine? This is going to appear as a word cloud, so let's keep it kind of succinct if you could. Maybe one or two words, and we'll see what we end up with here. I suspect that we all have some words that we think might want to, or will probably jump out at us. We've got acid, stone. Someone replied, I'm an agronomist. Salinity, chalky, acid. Salinity, yeah, again, flinty, chalky. Stone keeps coming up. Stone is overwhelmingly, well, that's with 3 votes. Here we go. Now they're really starting to come in. Oyster shell, earthy. What haven't I hit yet? Volcanic, gritty, rocky, acidic, steely, tinny, couple metallic sort of sensations. This is great. Whetstone. I knew that was going to come up. Flinty, of course, the usual suspect. So this was kind of fun to check out. Thanks, audience, for your input on that. Kind of shook out as we thought it might. So let's go to our panel here. So glad to have you all in. Thanks, audience, for checking in on that. So in response to the audience poll, Anna Catherine Mansfield, what is minerality from where you sit?
Sure. So I'm sitting in the seat of a flavor chemist and a sensory scientist. And so for me, that word cloud really just shows us that minerality is a problem, because we don't have a lot of agreement over what that term means. We don't know if it's a single word. Is it just minerality, or is it a family of words? It looks like that was a family of words, right? That are all sort of sitting under minerality. And we also don't agree if it's a taste. Is it a smell? Is it a mouthfeel? Is it some combination of those? And beyond that sort of individual disagreement, we don't agree when we do studies on wine experts in different countries. People use minerality differently, or mineralité differently in France than they do in New Zealand, where there's been a lot of work. I have some colleagues in both of those places who've done work on that, and they use it differently in both of those places than we use it in the United States. So the biggest problem I see is that when we taste a wine and we say, oh, I sense minerality, we know exactly what we mean. We can probably describe that in some detail, but other people are interpreting that as something completely different. So it's a communication problem.
Anne-Marie Morse, you see this as a problem too, a communication problem or otherwise?
Absolutely. Well, in my line of work with judging wine competitions, you can have judges from all over the world in a competition, and you're judging and you're trying to assess a wine. And then again, as Anna Catherine pointed out, you can have a very different perspective of what that means. It could be all different things to many different people. To be sometimes, minerality has even been described as a lack of aromas, right? So it would be something that you're not getting fruit, you're not getting vegetal qualities, you're not getting herbs or floral things. You're not getting some of those things. So then you start to say, well, that's a mineral quality because it's lacking aromas. For other people, it actually can also sometimes be like a texture thing. So in other words, high acid has often been attributed to that, possibly a little salinity as well. An acid that might have a higher, like I said, wine that might have a higher acid content or some salinity qualities might be what some people are going to refer to as minerality as well.
Thomas, what do you think people mean when they say minerality? What do you mean when you say minerality and those that you deal with?
So I'm coming from the perspective of a sommelier, a person who serves wine from around the world in the setting of restaurants. And it's very much my goal to get people excited about wine. In the community of winemakers, sommeliers, we tend to reference minerality as an expression of the type of soil or the expression of the type of microclimate that might exist where the vines are growing that produce the grapes that make the wine that we're enjoying. So some examples that I would use is minerality in a unoaked white wine from the Chablis region in France might be described as having a chalky or limestone or stony kind of aromatic. When we think of somebody who said volcanic before, when you smell wines coming from Mount Etna in Sicily, they have tend to have a pronounced aromatic of a sort of smoky, ashy characteristic, which is often attributed to the type of soil that it's grown in, which is volcanic. And so in short, minerality, I think about it as an expression of the type of soils or the type of environment where the grapes are being grown for that particular wine. And there is I think of it as being part of a language. It is an accompaniment to the fruit profile, the acid profile, the tannic profile. And it's often something that when the communication is healthy and when a similar language is learned, it's a term that can be used to communicate the expression of a wine, whether you're in the United States or France or New Zealand. When you're tasting that same wine or a region's wine around the world, there are common terms that can be used to describe the minerality of the region where that wine comes from.
I want to
Thomas,
get back.
I have a question for you. All right. I have a question for you that kind of gets, I think, to the production issues of wine. Do you feel, and actually Anne-Marie, you too, do you feel that minerality increases or decreases with age as a wine ages?
I'll be quick and then I'll pass it over. I think that it depends on the wine. For instance, a young Chablis, a Chardonnay-based wine from the Chablis region of France, one of the northernmost regions that's very cool in climate, tends to have a steely, salty, tangy minerality on the palate, also tends to smell of what we would describe as, a sort of stony, chalky characteristic. When that wine ages, that characteristic is still persistent, though it becomes a slightly more mature version of it. It starts to become a little bit more earthy and dense as opposed to light and fresh in its character. If you taste a Syrah-based wine from the Northern Rhone Valley, then this sort of granitic, smoky character is very present in its youth, but it tends to become even more exaggerated when it's older. And so I would say it really depends on the wine, and also a wine's aging and progression is not linear. It's in fact can be all over the place. And so that perception of mineral character, the minerality of that wine, it can be very present when young, not present at middle age, and then come back out and be very expressive when it's older. So I don't think that it's necessarily a linear progression. It depends very much on the wine and the region that it's coming from.
I agree a lot with what Talon said. I mean, sometimes I think you're going to find wines that, as they get aged, the acidity level might smooth out a little bit. It might become a little less austere, which is again an attribute that we think of when we think of mineral wines. But then some of them are going to increase in that, lack of some of the other aromas that you might be thinking of. Like they might, the reduction of your fruit aromas might help increase the perception of minerality as wine ages as well. Good question, Catherine.
Yeah, the reason I ask it is thinking as a chemist from the flavor chemistry side, because we can either say, all right, here are the descriptors that a lot of people are agreeing on, and we can work backwards and try to figure out what compounds, what chemicals cause the descriptors, or we can say, here are chemicals that we have. Let's have a bunch of people smell them and see how they describe them. And in the case of minerality, all of the research is having to start with, here are descriptors. Experts vaguely agree that these wines have minerality, but we haven't been able to track that down to an individual component the way we have with, say, methoxypyrazine smells like green pepper. if you get methoxypyrazine in any red wine, Cabernet Sauvignon, you're going to have green pepper. But the fact that that's why I ask about aging, because that would give me a hint as a chemist whether what class of compound potentially we're calling minerality. And if it's doing different things, that makes it a lot harder. That makes me think it's a collection of compounds rather than a specific thing we can point to, and maybe different ratios of different characteristics.
Another valid point. And I think the fact that it's a combination of things seems to make the most sense in this. Again, is it tactile? Is it all, aromatics? I think it's a combination of both, which is really makes it even more hard to pin down, right?
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
I want to shift gears a little. Well, actually, dive a little deeper back into the sensory side of things. I mean, do we have the acute, specific sensory capacity to differentiate between mineral content and other tastes? Is there overlap? Are we having varying experiences? Are we all built the same way? You know what I mean? You had kind of hinted about that. Anna Catherine, how does that one strike you?
Sure. Yeah, no, we are absolutely not built the same way. That's why sensory science is both wonderful and really, really frustrating, because humans are abysmal at replicating themselves when they're tasting the same wine different days, or replicating each other. And it's because there's so much variation in all of our receptors and our thresholds and everything else. We teach a whole 2-day class on that, where we actually call the EnoCert 201, where we have people experiment with their own sensory framework to figure out where they fit in the world. But so in addition to this sort of language problem where we may not be using the term the same way, it's really hard to even make sure that the same compounds are triggering what we're experiencing. I know Thomas is a musician, and so similar, like he and I could both play the same piece of music and someone could listen to it, but they might feel quite differently than when we feel, what we feel playing it. It's kind of hard to translate into words, a sensory perception that isn't a word. Did I answer the question? Did I go too far afield?
No, I think so. This brings me back to the fundamental question. We were talking about this the other day in our pregame huddle, which is, it's kind of important to kind of back up and ask, why is understanding minerality important? Who is it useful for? There's a lot of jargon being kicked around these days. Sometimes it leads to poor communication. I don't know. I'll ask for each of your takes on why it actually is. This is an important conversation that we're having today. What does it mean to you? What do you think it means to other people? Thomas, kick it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll reiterate kind of what I said before, which is that the use of the term minerality, that it's vocabulary. It's also a learned process to be able to detect it. I'll give a couple of quick examples, but I think of it as muscle memory, or exercising a muscle, or using a common language. I'll probably use those terms a little bit more frequently than anything else. But in the context of wine, which is what we are essentially focusing on, the notion of minerality is usually it refers to a potential character of a region or of a style of wine that gives it typicity. And why is typicity important? Well, it depends on what your perspective is. Some people may not want typicity. Some people may want, a Chardonnay to have residual sugar and, have some sweetness. That's uncommon. But generally, typicity in the form of a Chardonnay that's coming from the Burgundy region of France is that it will have certain common factors, which is to say, on the aromatics, that sort of stony aromatic characteristic; on the palate, a little bit more of a sharp presence of acidity, that sense of salinity, that sense of a salty kind of character. We're combining the aromatic components as well as what you detect on the palate, which is to say what you can actually sense in your mouth. So minerality, the presence of minerality and typicity, it is one of the most fundamental components of what the great classic wines are based on. And that's why many of them have achieved this level of greatness. When you taste a Bordeaux wine from the left bank, a combination of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, and it comes from the more gravelly soils of the Pessac-Léognan subregion, for instance, a great example being an Haut-Brion Bordeaux, it has a typicity, and as a style and a characteristic has given it a nobility and a prestige over the years, such that if that winery stopped making the wine with that style, or if the soil, for instance, or whatever components were not contributing to the wine what it had been, it lacks the typicity and therefore devalues the characteristics that it's become known for. And I'm not saying devalues from a monetary standpoint, but the whole notion is one of the reasons why a place like Bordeaux, and specifically Left Bank Bordeaux from Pauillac or Grave, they became known as great wines because of their typicity, their ability to age, their regal nature, and also let's face it, taste is something that's learned, taste is something that's developed. We learn to appreciate those characteristics. So unless as a culture, we start to shift, and this is a whole nother conversation, if we get into the notion of natural wine or skin contact white wines, also known as orange wines, it starts to go into the direction of style, and that there is typicity there too. But I think kind of coming it back together, bringing it back together, I think that the notion of minerality as being part of the language and as being having typicity in the wines, I think is what sets certain regions and certain styles apart, and what gives them the appreciation that we as wine collectors, as wine lovers, go for. That's what we seek out.
And Maria, I want to kick it over to you as a wine judge. Why is minerality important for you, and how does it kind of fit into your scheme when it comes to wine judging?
So again, some of this is very similar to what Thomas said, but I think it's really interesting to understand that when we're judging wines and we're assessing wines, you really have to think about a language, right? You have to have a shared language. You have to learn that language, so you have to be able to communicate. So when a wine is a certain style, you're trying to assess it on that style. You're going to assess, for example, a nice Finger Lakes Riesling, right, differently than you might assess a warm climate Riesling that will have more floral characters or more fruit characters going on. So, but that is not to say that the Finger Lakes Riesling might be a little bit more austere, is not just as good, if not a better wine, right, than the other. So it's a matter of being able to speak the language so that you can understand the style of the wine, that the fact that the balance might be slightly different as far as acid, but that doesn't make it not as good. It might make it better. Does that make sense? So you need to develop a certain language. And again, it comes down to education. And I think I'll get back to education a little bit more later as an educator of wine, but it's so important to be able to teach people to have these memories, to be able to understand and use the right language in describing a wine, whether it's a style, where it came from, but understanding that part of it, you need to develop that language and know what it means, right? Even if, as we pointed out, it's a variable situation when it comes to minerality.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought it from Chablis Chardonnay over to Bordeaux to Riesling. Viewer Chris asks, hi, what are your thoughts with minerality with red wines? I usually associate minerality with white, and particularly Chardonnay. What is the difference? Why do most people think about white wines when we consider minerality? Is it more nuanced when we get into red wines like Bordeaux? What's the deal there? Why is I don't know. That's the way I thought about it, kind of going into this. Is I associate minerality with white wine characteristics. Anna Catherine, what do you think?
I'd love to take a first shot at this because it's something that my colleague Jordi Ballister at the University of Burgundy and my other colleague in New Zealand, Wendy Parr, and I've talked about a lot. And if I could just take a hop back and think about the history of the term minerality, it of course came from France, and as far back as I actually called up Jordi and asked him, talked to him about this in preparation for this talk, as far back as he has found, as far back as the 1930s, people were using the pierre fusil or gunflint as a descriptor for Sancerre and Chablis. So in white wines in France, we had this gunflint aroma, flintlock gun kind of aroma, and it didn't become minerality. That didn't become a really popular term in French Francophone wine descriptors until mid 80s, late 90s, and that's when it really took off. And so Jordi actually says that he feels like the idea of terroir, that emergence in the 90s when it really kicked off and took up steam, and what he calls its geological magic, that really helped people link to this idea of, sort of as Thomas described it, as of the minerals in the soil, of the geology of the area and how that has an effect. So if we sort of start with that and then translate, that term into English, we get minerality kind of translating directly, but it wasn't until late 90s that we started to see a class of terms that were minerality, and that caused some confusion. And we had folks who were thinking, oh, well, we'll taste the soil, and it's that there's a direct transfer of minerals from the soil into the grape. And we have proven that that's not true. There is science that shows us that's not really possible. So I think I lost track of the question with my history lesson.
Well, I was just talking about the appreciation across different wine varieties, right? And
Yes, thank you, thank you,
yeah, yeah.
thank you. So it was originally used for white wines. I apologize. And Jordi still, when I tell him, okay, in the U.S. we're using it for reds, and he's like, no, that's impossible, not okay. You can't do that. So the Francophone wine speak, at least sensory scientists, I haven't been reading a lot of wine reviews in the past few years from there. They don't use it for red, they use it for white typically. Now, some of the subsets of words that are in the group of minerality, like say iron or tar, those show up in red, but minerality itself is only used for white in French. I see it in the US used for reds as a quality indicator. I mean, you never see a cheap plonk red wine said to have minerality. It only comes up in very expensive, very high end, usually things that aren't very fruity. So not like a super like long hang time Zinfandel. It's going to show up in another red. And Thomas probably has some thoughts on whether that's true or not in his career.
Well, I did see him nod. Thomas.
Indeed. And I think to go back to the beginning question, minerality in white wine most typically used in fact because of the fact that white wine is made from grapes that are white, where the grapes are pressed and the skin is not really used to contribute much in terms of the final wine when related to red wines, for instance. So with white wines, unless they are a varietal that screams of a particular characteristic, like if it's a Gewürztraminer with intense floral or aromatics, a white wine made from a Chardonnay is a very neutral grape varietal, relatively speaking. It can adapt and taste of the place where it's coming from in a warmer region. It'll have more tropical fruit aromatics and fruit characteristics and more of a dense feeling on the palate. In a cooler climate, it'll show more of a sharp acidic component, or what some people might describe as more of a mineral component. But in short, white wines, minerality has more traditionally been used to describe in characteristics of white wines because there's less other things going on in that wine. In red wines, there's skin contact, you have maceration, there's more oak aging, there are more components that contribute to the wine. And so I think minerality is less often used to describe the red wines because there are more terms usable based on the production of the red wines to describe it. With that said, echoing what has been said about certain red wines, having an iron characteristic. If it is a red wine it is a red wine made of grapes that are grown in clay, they tend to produce a characteristic that's a little bit more dense and robust, and so might be even said to have a clay minerality to it. If it's I mentioned before, a Syrah-based wine from the Northern Rhone Valley grown on granitic soils tends to have a little bit more of a smoky characteristic, which is often attributed to the grapes coming from vines grown on that granite. A very clear example is Grenache-based wines from the south of France in a very prestigious region like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which is known for making Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre blends. If you have Grenache that's grown on the more typical soils that are a combination of stones and clay with large rocks on top, the Grenache has a certain characteristic. But then if you taste that same Grenache planted on very sandy soils in particular subsections of that appellation, of that place of origin, Grenache grown on sand tends to be much finer, more aromatic, have a more white peppery kind of characteristic, so much so that a trained palate, a trained sommelier, whether you're on the West Coast, East Coast, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, if you've been experienced with those wines enough, somebody could hand you a glass, you would be able to swirl it, smell it, and pretty quickly on the aromatic be able to say, this is reminiscent of Grenache grown on sand because of the particular style of that. And by the way, the same thing, like again, it comes down to training the muscles or having a language that you use, but it's more that great tasters are not necessarily born, they're often developed. Some people have more acute sense of taste and smell, but generally speaking, the best wine tasters, if you're trying to decipher what that wine is, like what we call blind tasting, you have a glass put in front of you, tell me what this is. That usually comes from years and years of training yourself to be able to decipher the characteristics of the wine, to be able to land it in a certain place of the world.
Can I just hop in, and I want to qualify one thing from my point of view that Thomas just said, which is, you were saying that the wines characteristics like smoky are attributed to grapes, a specific variety grown in a certain soil. I just want to point out that is, as we've got that correlation, we have enough observations built up to say that we tasted lots of wines and they're all grown in the soil, and we see this in all of them. We don't have the scientific link yet. We don't know the causation. We don't know whether it's part of the winemaking. We don't know if it's, but any the microclimate, the soil in which a vine grows, is going to affect the secondary metabolites, which are the aroma compounds that are so important. So we know there's an interaction, but we just don't have the fine tuning yet to be able to figure out exactly what those chemicals are. So it's still observational data at this point.
100%. And I'll just say as a response or to support you, I completely agree that the science has not made the link. I think that we have to be able to use some sort of a corollary, and so therefore I think a lot of people just associate the style with where it's coming from and the type of soil, for instance. But I firmly believe that I think it's important to note that what's in the soil does not necessarily translate in the mineral character of the soil does not translate into what you are tasting and smelling. And I know that you made a very strong point of that in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
And I agree with that, but I also want to mention that I find that there's certain wines, again, going to the red wine idea, is that there are certain wines, especially grown on volcanic soils, which to me very often give me that sense of minerality, things from Mount Etna or Alianico from Taurasi and, Volcano. But there's just some, I think some certain types of climate, soils and climates that produce a certain style of wine very often. And again, we might not have a specific link and you're not tasting the minerals per se, but there definitely is some correlation there.
I want to ask you about like variable environmental factors, climate change. I have a good question from Susan here, which is kind of thought-provoking, maybe a tough one. How long does it take for the elements of terroir to affect the character of wine? For instance, would the recent fires in California affect the terroir of the soils and change the wines this soon? Is it, I don't know, any thoughts on this? Do we have any leading data on this?
They're changing the wines this soon because the grapes actually pick up some of the compounds from the smoke. So if the smoke is drifting through the vineyard, guaiacol is one compound that picks up that smells like rubber or smoke or tar. And that actually gets picked up by the grape and bound up with sugars in the grape. And then when you ferment it, the sugar releases that compound. So something called smoke taint. I actually put in a grant to study this. It's something that's a big concern in California right now. As far as long-term effects for, grapes that were planted 5 years after the fire, I don't think we know that yet.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, I've got a follow-up question, and I should say to the audience, now's the time to submit your questions. We have about 31 minutes left, right? So we've got plenty of time, but at the same time, the window's closing. I have another question from Oscar, which is related to this. Here's his take or his question. Do you think minerality has transformed into being a term just to describe otherness? Clay, tar, steel, shells, smoke, etc., and hence why it may be used for reds now in some countries. Side note, I've heard minerality used for reds in France. He may have missed the earlier part of our conversation, but any thoughts on Oscar's comment / question there? Is minerality replacing otherness?
I'll just jump in and say that there's many different ways to train on how you would describe wines. There's language that we choose to use. Yep. Traditionally speaking, as a wine professional, as a sommelier, somebody who works in restaurants and in the world of wine, you typically break down a wine's characteristics, starting with the aromatics, and some components that you might say is there a character of fruit? And if so, what kind of fruit aromatics would you describe? There's no apple in that wine, but there is a chemical component that reminds you of the smell of apple. Then you would go into something like earth components. Are you getting any of these earthy notes and what might be described as these mineral tones? And you would do the same if the wine is aged in wood, for instance. Do you smell an oak character, or is it a stainless steel wine and it doesn't smell of oak? So categorically, and the same would apply to the palate. And then you would talk about, is the alcohol seeming high, and does this wine taste hot? Does it taste like I just had a shot of vodka? And are you getting a burning character, or does it not? There and there's a lot, the tannins, the acidic structure, all of those things. You can break apart the wine's character, and it's important to do that because how it relates to other wines, and that is how you are assisted in learning how to decipher the differences between these wines. But I think the question of otherness, or is it of course, minerality is a category of its own, because it's not a fruit component. It's not a wood component. You're not getting a lactic character or the taste or smell of cacao or vanilla bean from the oak. It is a different character. So I think by virtue of the fact that it doesn't fit into the fruit category and it doesn't fit into the oak category, it is naturally like it's an etc. characteristic. But then I think in that same bucket would go if there are floral characteristics. Are we picking up, non-fruit and non-wood characteristics? They all have to kind of go somewhere. Minerality is one of those somewheres, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Perfect pivot point here. Let's talk about the science of perception a little bit. We categorize the senses as aroma, taste, mouthfeel, and so on. Let's talk about frameworks for appreciating wine and understanding it as it relates to our senses. Anna Catherine, I'll kick it off with you.
Can you be more specific in that question? Frameworks?
Sure. Yeah, for those of us who may be new to this kind of thing, when we're talking about minerality, for instance, to what degree does aroma kind of figure into it? There's taste, there's mouthfeel, there's viscosity and everything else that might come with it. Discuss a little bit about the frameworks, the formal ones that are in place, the disciplines that you kind of consider as an enologist.
Sure. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, especially given some of our previous conclusions that we don't know if it's a smell or a taste or a mouthfeel.
Yeah.
We can smell thousands of things, but we can only smell things that are volatile, which means they are released into the air. Now, one thing we know by definition, a mineral isn't volatile. So if I want to be really super sciencey, food scientists ruin everything kind of day, which I can do sometimes, we can't smell minerality because minerals don't have a smell, right? Also, many of them don't have a taste because of their crystalline structure. We say it was interesting when whetstone pops up in that minerality discussion, because whetstone actually in the 60s, a group in Australia found that it's actually what they're calling petrichor, which means that during hotter seasons, all the resins and the fauna, the flora, not the fauna, the flora around the stones will release, oils and other things that will fall dry on the stones. And then when it rains and those are re-wetted, it's like when you smell wet asphalt. It's not the asphalt itself necessarily. It can be all of the other surrounding plant material that has dried on that surface and now is being opened again. So framework for minerality itself is a little bit tricky. I'd say framework in general, we talk about both orthonasal smells. So when I swirl a glass and sniff with my nose and the volatile compounds travel through my nose to my olfactory bulb, where I sense smells. That's sort of orthonasal smell. It's what happens when you swirl the glass and sniff. Retronasal smell occurs when you put the wine in your mouth and then you breathe out. And that can be different than orthonasal smell because you're warming it up. Your saliva is starting to break components down. You'll get either contrasting or comparable aromas, which is interesting. And that's part of the palate. And then taste. There are only 5 that we know of right now: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, which is the savory. There are some others that are under investigation, like metallic or creamy, but as of right now, we only have good data for those 5. And in wine, I'd argue usually it's sweet, sour, and bitter, salty in some products, but usually these other 3. So in a sensory science point of view, if somebody says it tastes like peach, I'm like, okay, no, it doesn't. Peach has got sugar and acid, so it's sweet and sour, but everything else is aroma. And that's why flavor is a confusing term, because it's often a combination of those. So the thing that sort of Anne-Marie or Thomas has done in their training is to be trained in on a specific set, like a jargon, like the WSET, the Wine Education Spirit Trust, where you are trained in on a series of standards. Like, this is what apple smells like. This is what we're calling apple. Now go and find it in the wine. And then as long as you're talking with another, a group of people who are trained the same way, then we're calling apple, or we're all using the term the same way. So it's helpful when you're talking within that group, but it can be less helpful when you're talking to somebody who is, say, very new to this, hasn't practiced smelling. We don't do that normally as humans. We use our eyes first. We don't use our nose. So if I say something like cat pee or minerality and you aren't a wine person, you're like, huh? You're not sort of in on that jargon. So whom we're communicating to makes a difference.
Absolutely. And, following along on that, I think it's really interesting in the different types of framework we talk about, especially education-wise. So if you're talking like WSET, as Anna Catherine mentioned, they actually they discourage the use of the term minerality when describing a wine. They do have one descriptor that indicates wet stones, right? So in a class with the WSET students, somebody will say, well, how do you know what a wet stone smells and tastes like? Well, obviously it's not a taste. And you don't want you going around licking wet stones, right? That's probably a really bad idea of something to do. But you try to explain it as, hot day, stones, as Anna Catherine said, are releasing aromas. And is that really the stone or not? But it's something that some people can actually at least understand, right? And then use that as a language to describe a wine. And then when you took it, it was also interesting if you look at the quartermaster sommeliers, they actually have a category and they call it inorganic material, where they talk about things like flint and steel and stones and gravel. And so they do allow that mineral component to be discussed as a descriptor when you're trying to describe a wine. So there are different schools, there's other different, I'm not going to get into all of them, but there's different schools of thought, and there's different acceptable jargon or language you can use to describe a wine, again, depending on the framework that you have studied.
Great. I'm going to take a viewer question here. Unless Thomas, you had something. I'm sorry, I saw you gesture.
Yes, and I will say this right off the bat. This is unrelated to the topic of this entire discussion, but it is very pertinent to the discussion of this topic. For anyone out there who is in the wine world or appreciates wine, this is just a moment to pause and remind ourselves that wine is supposed to be enjoyed, and it's supposed to be enjoyed with other people. And it's supposed to be something that we enjoy over a meal or by itself, but most especially with people whom we enjoy, whose company we enjoy, preferably our loved ones. And I will say this as a note to all of the young, aspiring hospitality professionals out there, those of you who want to work in restaurants, particularly if you want to work with wine. Wine is an intimidating and scary thing for a lot of people. So this is the moment where I take off my sommelier wine deduction hat and I put on my hospitality hat. And I encourage all of you to know that language and communication is so, so important. And the level of detail to which we're speaking about wines now, this is the opposite of how you approach your table, your guests at the restaurant. Yes. You don't talk about wine this way. It really should be more conversational. And if language has to be a shared thing, this is a language that a lot of people don't know. So I'm just taking this pause, taking a beat to say, as it relates to guests and the guest experience, and especially for those of you working in restaurants, and also those of you who might be, selling wine to people in a tasting room or in a wine shop, it's really important to try to find the common language that you have with that individual. And more often than not, if somebody's trying to find a wine that they'll enjoy, talk to them about what they've enjoyed in the past. What styles of wine from where? What's the characteristics that they like in a wine? They may say sweet. The wine's not sweet, but that's the term that they choose to use. So just please remember that in pursuit of making wine more accessible and something that goes on more people's tables, especially in America, which has historically not been a wine drinking culture, though we are now ramping up very quickly. Just be sure not to make it scary. Keep it fun. Try to use the language that other people can use, and you can use more generic descriptors with people in a restaurant setting. If it's a softer wine or a more dense wine or a lighter wine, is it very aromatic or not really aromatic? Like basically, just try to find a language that person can use, so you don't intimidate them. Because the more wine drinkers in our world, the better off we all will be. So I just had to take that moment to put the hospitality hat back on and just say, let's keep wine very friendly. And now we can break and we can go back to all the detailed stuff.
It's fun to argue too. Thanks for that, Thomas. So you're right.
And yeah, very well said, Thomas. Thank you for reminding us.
Good. We'll keep that cat pee descriptor in the back pocket then.
Exactly.
I have a question from Rebecca here. Let's again another pivot. Let's get into the winemaking process. So Rebecca asks, how does the minerality of natural or sustainable wines differ from conventionally produced wines? Right. So if we get into, to what degree can a winemaking process influence certain outcomes and expressions of minerality in wine? I'll just throw a jump ball up there. Anybody can take that one. We're talking about preservatives, things along those lines. Yeah.
So I was going to say, I'm not really feel like I'm an expert to talk on the impact of sustainability on that. So if anyone else can do that. But what I was going to say is definitely winemaking processes will have an impact on the style of the wine and the level of minerality. As far as sustainability, unfortunately, I can't speak to that. I don't know if one of my colleagues can.
I think it was more about natural wine versus conventionally produced wine.
Yeah.
That's what I got out of that.
So yeah, I think we all were like hesitating to see if somebody else was going to do it. So part of my job is I'm an extension enologist for the whole state of New York. So my colleague and I are the two folks that answer questions for wineries. So we spend a lot of time helping people fine tune winemaking processes. Minerality, however you choose to define it, if you're defining it basically as something that isn't super fruity, if we take that as for this discussion, take that as a basic, some things you can do to sort of get more minerality is to harvest earlier, so you don't have super ripe fruit, because you're going to have fewer of the big fruitiness food of the components that give a lot of fruitiness, and less sugar, which is going to give you sort of less perception of fruitiness at the end when the alcohol is completely fermented. But also in non-natural wine situations, many producers purchase specific strains of yeast because these yeasts, in addition to the grapes, there are precursors that the yeast can release to give certain aromas and flavors, and the yeast themselves can produce certain aromas and flavors. And some yeast are very good at producing esters, which are all of the fruity floral aromas that we find in wines. And so you would never use a high ester producing yeast if you wanted to make a wine that had a lot of minerality, because you're covering it up with that fruit, right? In natural wines, commercial yeast is almost always not used. There's no official definition for this, but the philosophy is usually whatever you've got, the indigenous, the wild yeast that's floating around is what you're going to use for your fermentation. And because those are often, they aren't things that have always been optimized for fermentation, because they haven't been, sampled in wine producing areas or something like that. It's just whatever's there. They can take a lot longer to ferment, and longer fermentations mean the yeasts are working harder. So the secondary metabolites, the flavor and aroma compounds are kicking out, are going to be less along the lines of big fruity things and more of these others that aren't fruity, including minerality. Also, to Tom, I think Thomas mentioned orange wines earlier. In orange wines, which are often popular with natural winemakers, which are treating a white wine like a red grape, where you're actually doing skin contact time during the fermentation with the white, you're extracting some different phenolic compounds that can give some texture in the mouth that may also be associated with minerality in a white wine. So lower fruit, more other, and sometimes sort of more phenolic character, and longer, slower fermentations are probably going to give you less fruit overall. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Thomas.
Yeah, I would add also, just trying to use the layman's terms here. Natural wine versus conventional wine. I don't think of it as it's not one or the other. It's a gradient. When people say conventional, there's often the thought of using chemical herbicides and pesticides in a vineyard. There's the thought of using a lot of chemicals or additives in the winery, in the winemaking process to usher it along. So I think the definitions are vague, just in the same way that a natural wine, there is no certification for natural wine. It's typically more referred to the winemaking process than the grape growing process, whereas something like organic can be certified because it is a finite set of, this science. There's a finite set of regulations that you have to abide by. When you say that you have a natural wine, it is a very loose term. In case in point, bad example would be if you called a natural wine that's made by a farmer in France, organically farming and making the wine without any additives, that wine can still taste as clean, pristine, and etched as a conventionally produced wine, because that farmer and the winemaker treated the wine very, very particularly. That is a natural wine. But then the more commonly understood, more commonly known version of a natural wine is one where it's a lack of intervention, but also it is a permissibility of certain characteristics to end up in the wine that a traditional winemaking process would not allow for. And a lot of times they are flaws. There's a presence of Brettanomyces, or Brett as is referred, which is a bacterial infection. There can be the presence of volatile acidity, which is one of the components or one of the derivatives of winemaking, but in a higher concentration, you can get aromatics that smell more like nail polish remover than a wine that you'll enjoy. There's a lot, and again, the glossary does not include some of these terms. I should have put those in there. But the point is, most people think of natural wine and they think of wines that are cloudy, hazy, and are a little bit more funky in style, and so don't have the more traditional fruit mineral characteristics. But I just wanted to sort of highlight the fact that there's not a right answer here. I'm kind of just riffing, but I'm basically saying that natural wine doesn't have a definition. Conventional is a loose term, but natural wines these days are more popular because they give you the sensation that it's perhaps better for you because there's been less manipulation of the wine. Whereas there can be naturally made wines that do drink more like classic conventional wines. So it's a tricky topic. So I say proceed with caution.
Yes. Oh, Christopher, you're muted.
There we go. I only do this for a living. Valerie has a question here. Can speakers talk more about minerality or other characteristics of our cold climate Finger Lakes wine? We're all here in the heart of New York's wine country. We all love our beloved Riesling. Thomas, I know you're a producer. Talk a little bit about minerality and other characteristics. What makes New York wine, specifically Riesling, kind of unique? How does it differ from old world Riesling, right? From Mosel or otherwise? Because our audience may not be intimately familiar with what we're about to talk about. Who wants to take that one? Anne-Marie.
Sure. So in the Finger Lakes, it's a beautiful area. If you haven't been here, you'll have to come. And we have some amazing wines and people doing some great things with various varieties. Yes, we have some. We're really well known for our Rieslings. Our Rieslings are just, world class. They compare really well with Rieslings from all over the world. And we have a lot of different styles. We are very unique, or not unique completely, but we do have a very interesting area because we have lots and lots of microclimates. Because our lakes were dug out by glaciers many years ago, we have different soils, a lot of slopes that change we have different size slopes. We also have, because of the depth of the lakes, different depths, there's different microclimates in there. So we have areas that are warmer, right? Areas that are colder. So we are definitely a cool climate region, but we have different types. You can have many different styles and types of grapes. So you'll go to a winery and there will be some wineries probably have 5 to 10 different types of Rieslings that they're going to offer you if you want to do a tasting. And they're impacted by various things. They're impacted certainly by the climate and the terroir, but you can decide to oak age some, you can decide to keep some in steel tanks, as Anna Catherine was saying, all different kinds of yeast. There's lots of different things you can do with it. So we really run the gamut, but I definitely know that our wines are first class. They compare very well, but we also have some slaty soils similar to those in the Mosel region. We also have some slopes. So we have our climate's not all that different very often. Sometimes we have a little colder, I'm saying, especially when it's really cold out today, but we're comparable to what I consider some of the best Riesling regions in the world. Does that answer the question? Sorry, I don't know if I got off track there.
I think it does. Let's kick it around the horn. Anna Catherine, what do you think?
What makes our Riesling unique? I don't, again, because I don't use the term very much, I don't feel like we have a lot of minerality. I feel like our Riesling in the Finger Lakes tends to be higher acid because of our cooler climate, as Anne-Marie mentioned. And we talked before about how acid is sometimes equated with a perception of minerality. And the sensory studies on typicity that we've done with winemakers in the region, it's the terms that bubble up most often as typical are peach or apricot and lime or lime zest. So we do this, like a characteristic tends to be this peachy liminess, although that's just talking to producers on one end. So that may not be what, from the Somme world. Thomas, you may have different views on that. So we tend to, our style is becoming more and more dry, although there's usually a range of sweetness available, but there's some really outstanding, very well structured, peachy, limey, dry Rieslings. I'll kick it to Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this could be a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
It's something I talk about often. I grew up in New York City, but I moved to the Finger Lakes, went to Cornell and fell in love with food and wine and got into restaurants thereafter and stayed in restaurants instead of pursuing my medical career. I was pre-med, class of 06. And one of the reasons was because we had this amazing viticultural area to be in. And I now actually make some wine in the Finger Lakes, or I should clarify, I started a winery project called Empire Estate in 2014, focused just on Riesling that is made dry. Recruited one of my good friends, Kelby James Russell, who's the winemaker at Red Newt Cellars. He also makes his own wines, and he actually makes the wines for Empire Estate, and we share some space at his winery. And one of the initial pursuits is the Finger Lakes as a region is a very dramatic viticultural area. It was carved out by the last ice age. So can you imagine, a massive glacier coming north and south year after year through the middle of New York State and carving out the center of the state, almost like a rake going through, pebbles or through sand, and creating these large rivers that were very deep, that ended up getting stoppered up in the north and the south. And these are the Finger Lakes. So they're actually remarkably deep, dense bodies of water, some that go below sea level. And they are remarkable conductors of energy. So we have a unique terroir or sense of place, in part based on the fact that we have these dramatic lakes with relatively steep pitched slopes that are alongside them. There's not a lot of other places in the world that have that. And other places that do grow Riesling, we can draw reference to them. But in fact, the Finger Lakes terroir is extremely unique. What I can say definitively is that the mother rock of New York State is shale, and it's comparable to slate. It can be broken away quite easily. And so the terroir, or the expression of the soil of the shale, is one component. But because the glaciers carved the Finger Lakes, they left every year, almost like, think about when a wave comes in and it kind of pushes stones on a beach and it leaves striations of where that last wave came. So too did the glaciers with the Finger Lakes, and left bands of unique soils, topsoils, that came from the northern climes. And so you might, driving south to north in the Finger Lakes, you might find a mile or a patch of land going up the lake that has an intense gravel deposit on top of it. Whereas a mile later, you might find more along the lines of like a sandstone or a loess. Then there might be parcels that are pure shale with like a thin little toupee of grass on top of it. And so it just is based on how these lakes were carved. And so that is where I come to talking about Riesling specifically. Riesling, much like Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or Nebbiolo from Italy, these are varietals, they're grape varietals that naturally conduct or give a sense of the type of soil and terroir or microclimate in which they're grown very well. So when the Riesling vineyards, and we don't own the farms, we have amazing farmers who've been farming in the area sometimes for multiple generations. When we have a Riesling farm that's planted on a very shale, topsoil being all shale, the Riesling expresses itself in a very different way than the Riesling that's planted in a very dense clay parcel, for instance. And so this is where, again, not getting too much into the science of it, but vines that are planted on dense clay, the clay retains a lot of water, the water translates to the vines grow the grapes in a very different way, typically leading to a Riesling grape that is much more resplendent and dense and more powerful in its character of flavor than, for instance, a Riesling that is grown on a steep parcel of pure shale, where it might be cooler and there's less water to be absorbed from that porous rock. And so the Riesling there tends to taste right off the vine, by the way. You can do the tasting in these two vineyard sites that same day. And this is what we do when we're picking the grapes, and also just to see flavor development, that in fact, the grapes taste differently from those vines coming from those different soils. And in fact, the wines will taste differently if treated exactly the same way, fermented the same way, that the Riesling coming from that steeper pitched site of shale that is a little bit cooler tends to be a little bit more acidic, a little bit more sharp, it would have a little bit more bite to it. And the flavors of the Riesling might be a little bit more like, think like lemon, lime, Sprite, that kind of more citrusy profile, versus the Riesling grapes coming from a vine that's planted on that dense clay site, mid Seneca Lake, where there's a lot more of an effect from the lake itself. There, that Riesling grape, and then the wine that is made from those bunches, tends to be a little bit more powerful, even tends to be a bit riper. The chemistry proves that that grape is actually riper, has a higher sugar content, and its pH and acid balance is different. And that resulting wine will taste more full and more generous. And the fruits translate from apple, lemon, lime now to like a pineapple, mango, papaya, apricot characteristic. And so this is my long way of saying that there are various different terroirs in the Finger Lakes, but generally speaking, I agree with everything that was said before in terms of the cool climate nature of the Finger Lakes as compared to other parts of the world, in terms of how it attributes certain characteristics to the wines.
Perfect. Good, well-rounded, comprehensive answer from all three of our panelists. Thank you, Valerie, for that question. Excellent one. This takes us to my favorite part of the show, where we play What Did You Bring? This is where we each share something that we think is cool, that helps us appreciate wine more, that helps us better in our work and everything that we do. So let's kick it around the horn. Anna Catherine, rather. What did you bring today?
Sure. So I really dithered about this, but I ended up bringing one of my favorite books about wine sensory characteristics. And it's actually one I got in a great wine shop in Burgundy called the Athenaeum, called Le Parfum de Vin. And unfortunately, I did check today, it's not available yet in an English translation. But they do at least write the names of each of the aroma characteristics in English. So if you can sort of muddle your way through French, you'll be okay. But I love it because it gives you, both a lovely visual of different the other things that we compare wine to, because we name scents by other scents, right? We don't name them by their compound, but it also gives you the chemical compounds that are the impact odorants, or the most important volatiles in each of these, and what wines they may show up in. So it's both sort of visually lovely and has the kind of like detailed characteristics that I really enjoy.
Perfect, thank you. So we shared the URL for an A-Books link for it, which should help any of those that are interested in learning more about that book. Thomas, what'd you bring?
I brought a fancy version of something that's relatively simple, and this is a decanter. So what I have is a Zalto decanter. It comes from the Zalto crystal manufacturing family in the south of Austria. It's a really, really beautiful example of what a decanter is. The reason why I brought it is because I'm a very service-focused individual, being in restaurants, being a sommelier, and the decanter is used for, I'm just bringing it up because it should be used more often in our day-to-day wine drinking. A lot of people think that they should keep this for only fancy wines that need to be poured off because they're older and you want to separate the wine from the sediment because it's an older wine. But in fact, a decanter is a great day-to-day piece. If you have a white wine that's coming out of the fridge, it's probably too cold to like really enjoy the complex aromatics and flavors of it, even if it's an everyday wine. If you decant a white wine, it will open up aromatically more quickly. In the same way, a red wine, if you decant it, and it can be, you know, a $20 bottle of Côte de Rhône, if you do give it a little bit of extra air, it releases a lot of the delicious aromatics and flavor profiles to it. And so this is my sort of PSA of saying, don't serve your white wines too cold. If you're pulling them from the fridge, let them warm up, you know, for 10, 15 minutes so that they're not, you know, at 32 degrees, rather than they're closer to, you know, 45, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And for our red wines, we often serve them too warm. Room temperature is not really, room temperature in our book, you know, it's not really 68. We're usually in the low 70s. Red wines really are more delicious when they're in the high 50s, low 60s. So throw your red wine into a fridge in a decanter for 10, 15 minutes and then enjoy it. And you don't have to get a fancy decanter. You can also use a mason jar, anything that will allow you to pour that wine from the bottle into a vessel that just lets it, that aerates the wine and gets it going faster. So yeah, don't serve your white wines too cold. Don't serve your red wines too warm, and use a decanter to open up a wine quickly so it's more enjoyable right away.
Very good segue on the importance of glass. So we have a link to share where Anna Catherine shot a video the other day in partnership with the Corning Museum of Glass. We'll drop that in the chat there, where she talks about the importance of the actual wine vessels that you drink out of. So we'll let the audience do their own homework on that one on the side. Thank you so much for that one, Thomas, on the Zalto carafe number 75. Anne-Marie, what'd you bring?
So I leave it in here, it's easier to see, but this is called a Durand. It is basically something that will help you open corks, vintage corks, so that you have, it's hard to show you, but it allows you to preserve the cork with a cork that might, you know, crumble on you because of age or whatever else. But it's just a really interesting corkscrew that allows you to open up vintage bottles. So I just thought that was kind of a cool gadget, and I wanted to share that with you. It comes in a cool little cork thing too.
So Thomas, you mentioned you don't bust out the Durand for every bottle you open, right? You want to demonstrate some sort of facility with a classic wine key. What's the deal with the Durand? When do you use it?
So the Durand is actually a pretty new device. It's only been on the market for maybe 8 years, but it's actually a combination of two devices. It's a combination of a traditional corkscrew, so the worm that you twist into the cork, but it also has these two metal prongs on the side of it, which are derived from a device called an ASO. AH-SO. And the ASO was traditionally used in traditional wine culture to remove old corks, because what it does is there's two tines of the ASO. You slide them in between the cork and the neck of the glass. So it goes in and you twist it out. Think about like going to, you know, the carnival and having something kind of, you know, having the claw come down and pinch a little teddy bear and pull it up. That's kind of what this does for the cork. So these are basically two of the rudimentary wine tools that we've known and loved, but put into one device. And it's excellent for removing very old corks, as was mentioned, that might crumble. So I tend to use this, especially in the restaurant setting and at home, if I treat myself or our family to a nicer, older bottle. You know, it's something that we use for bottles that are maybe 15, 25, 35 years of age and have corks that are much more sensitive. Sure, you can use it for your, you know, 2020 Chardonnay from California, but the purpose is, you know, use it for using it on old bottles with older corks that need a little bit more care in getting them out.
Perfect. Thank you all for sharing those. I appreciate you bringing those today. And thanks to Lois for the segue into the glass. She was curious about what glass to use and when, so I'm glad we were able to share your video, Anna Catherine. I want to thank the audience for bringing the strong questions, great engagement today. Panelists, it's been an absolute pleasure. I learned a lot, and I hope that our audience has learned a lot. I wish you all the best, and thank you so much. Stay strong, stay safe, and we'll see you at the next keynote. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later.
Cheers.
All right, cheers.